So, thanks for coming. My name's Jonathan White. I'm a surgeon. I work out of the Royal Alexandra Hospital. This is the third time that Kim's asked me to come and address this topic. And I've taken a couple of different angles at it. This time I'd like to talk about kind of the relationship between technology and bodies, slightly in a more personal way, which is why I'm coming up with the title kind of, Welcome to the Singularity. Because by the end of this, hour or something, we should have thought of some ways that the issues that we've been discussing in quite an abstract sense, in terms of technology and computer and AI, that sort of thing, may actually affect us kind of where we live, kind of our bodies and our place in the world. So you might say, well, who is this guy to be talking about singularity issues and technology? So I'm a surgeon. I trained most of my training in the UK. And then I moved to Calgary, first of all, 2004, to do a fellowship. And then I got offered a job in Edmonton. I ended up staying here. And my other area of interest is surgical education. So I'm interested in how you teach and train surgeons, or residents, I suppose, medical students, to become surgeons, and the kind of processes that happen in the operating room. I'll talk about my relationship with bodies as well, in a practical sense as a surgeon. The other thing is that I am, the other half of my life, I'm a bit of a techno geek. And I'll talk about my relationship with devices and technology as well as we go through this talk. I am currently the Tom Williams Endowed Chair in Surgical Education. So I get to spend maybe about 50% of my time studying surgical education and studying how we train better surgeons. I won't talk a lot about education in this talk, but I should mention my position. Hopefully you have been to YouTube and maybe had a quick look at the first talk that I gave, which is just about a year ago now. And the title of that talk was A Biological Repairman's Reflections on the Coming Singularity, talking about embodiment, talking about Kurzweil's idea of spiritual machines. And that's the slide set. It was quite a kind of large, expansive talk, talked about a lot of different things, got off topic quite easily. And then the last time I came here to talk, I cut it down a bit. I talked about technology and the body specifically, and I used a kind of a fairly sparse slide set then, really bringing out some of those ideas into finer focus. So this time around, I thought I'd address some of the topics that I talked about before and expand some of them in some other ways. So specifically, the things I want to talk about is what's the surgeon's connection with the body? What's my experience of the body? Then to kind of think on the broader picture of what bodies are for, and to talk about some of the problems with them. And then lastly, to talk in a bit of detail about what the singularity will or might do to these things that we live in called bodies. So the first part of that is the surgeon and the body. And I created this podcast called Surgery 101. And this is a photograph. I actually have an app on the iPhone and on the Android as well. And we were trying to get an image for the splash page. Like when the app opens up, what does the picture show? And I got a friend of mine to take this picture of me in the OR. And there I am with my hat on and my mask and my headlight. And in one hand I've got an instrument. In the other hand I've got the iPhone. In fact, we ended up not being able to use this image for the app because Apple won't let you use images of its own products in your app. So we had to actually replace it with something else. But I think this is a good example of where I am. Part of me is the surgeon dealing with the body, but the other part is the techno geek, the technologist with the iPhone in his hand. And here's a definition I use when I give the talk in first year about surgery, first year medical school, about what surgery is. It's about using your hands to operate on the body. This is from we actually decompose the word and look at its roots in language. And we say surgery is using your hands to operate on the body to do something, to combat, to alleviate, to prevent three different things: distress and suffering and death. And that's kind of what I do. I was interviewed recently about being a surgeon by one of our medical school clubs, and they said, why would you choose to be a surgeon rather than something else? A pathologist, a nephrologist, a pediatrician, say. And I said, because, it's nice fixing things with your hands, it's nice fixing things and making them better. it's also nice because it's a personal thing. I'm not relying on drugs that I'm prescribing or some x-ray machine I'm pressing the big button on. It's something that I'm doing myself personally with my hands. So when I talk to medical students about surgery, I say, surgery is not something that I do. Surgery is something that I am. It's kind of an internal part of my identity now. And surgeons, I think a lot of surgeons would feel that way, that we have a very strong professional identity. We are all biological organisms, and that's where disease comes from. Like if biology was better and it didn't break down, you wouldn't need people like me. It's a function of biology. And the problem is, biology is not infinitely variable, but very variable. I was talking to somebody, I was away at a meeting last week in Ottawa, and we said there's something like 12,500 different diseases classified in the world. There are a lot of different ways that bodies can break down, and a lot of different variation inside each individual disease. You've got things like infection, inflammation, cancer, neoplasia, different things. So really when you're addressing a biological system like that, treating it is about dealing with knowing the ways that biology tends to break down and fail. And again, when I'm talking to my students, I talk about the surgeon being the biological repairman. Like I'm Mr. Fix-It, I'm Bob the Builder. I come along and I rewire things, I cut out the bad parts, I deal with blockages like I'm a plumber, I fix things that are leaking. And if you want some examples of those operations that I do or have, I don't do all these anymore because I'm specialised now. I do mostly bowel and colon cancer surgery. But cardiac bypass, you're plumbing those vessels in the heart. You're kind of rewiring where the blood flows. Hip replacement is replacing the broken, worn-out hip. The bad parts that come out, I do a lot of cancer surgery, so that's a good example of that. Things like obstruction in the bowel, as blockages, evil humours. We put a tube into the chest to take blood or fluid out, perhaps. Leaks, things like ulcers that perforate. And then things like breast enlargement, actually upgrading the basic model, and we talk about upgrades and augmentations in a minute. This is a very typical way that I spend my evening. This is a laparoscopic appendectomy. This is there's a camera coming in there, that port on the left-hand side. This is somebody's abdomen. Their head is to the left of the picture, their feet is on the right. The camera's coming in from the left, and then I'm standing at the top of the screen operating on the appendix, which is kind of marked with an arrow there in this diagram. And here's our patient with the pain in her tummy, that's appendicitis, and here's the appendix. This is actually a different operation to bring the appendix out and open appendectomy. And I spend a lot of my time dealing with biological structures like this. And I also spend a lot of my time dealing with the consequences that we are frail and that we do not deal well with rapid deceleration. We don't deal well with blunt injury. We don't deal well with being penetrated by being stabbed. And if you're living in Edmonton in 2012, you should be aware that Edmonton is a fairly dangerous city in terms of the number of knives that are in circulation. Not so much in terms of guns, but there's still a fair number of guns around, and in terms of motor vehicle accidents. When I'm on call at night, I see a lot of people who come in stabbed or shot or crushed in a car, and I'm very aware of the frailty of biology, if you might say. So as I say, that's my understanding of myself as a surgeon, Bob the Builder. I think it's a fairly simple way of thinking about surgery. You could argue it's actually a way to make something quite complicated quite simple. To say, well, we train all these years to do something very complicated, and then I represent myself as a biological fixer, perhaps. There is, of course, a talk in the literature now. This is from a recent article of the Canadian Medical Association Journal called Surgery Down for the Count, and basically saying that new technologies are eclipsing traditional surgical methods, and that, for instance, angioplasty has replaced cardiac bypass. And hopefully, if there's medical treatment of arthritis, maybe we won't need to replace joints anymore. Perhaps one day we'll actually get to the point where we're able to control or reverse a cancer that develops, or even prevent a cancer developing at some point in the future. And people who are writing articles like this are looking forward and saying, well, maybe surgery is not going to be here for the next 200 years the way it's been for the last 200 years. And we'll talk a little bit about the paradigms that we'll be discussing when we talk about controlling and understanding what's really happening in the body, and how hopefully this is actually right. I'd quite like maybe 50 years from now or 100 years from now that there isn't anybody left who does my job. Like, I'll be unemployed, or whoever comes after me will be unemployed, because we'll have understood the body to such a degree you won't need to cut things out anymore. And there's a slide I use for the first year medical students where it says, the class of 2112 visits the Edmonton Surgical Museum and says, can you believe they used to cut people open with a knife? Ew, what a nasty thing that must have been. We look back at the way we used to treat people with trepanation and amputations and different things that we really don't do in the modern world anymore. Hopefully surgery is going to change. Having said that, though, and I guess the problem with giving a talk about the singularity is you're stuck in 2012. I think your view on the singularity will be very different in 2032, 2042, but we're kind of stuck with what we have at the moment. And I think we need surgery as long as we're stuck in these biological bodies, or at least until we can figure out how things actually work at a molecular, cellular level. So let's turn to the next part, which is talk about what our bodies are for. And this is where the talk gets a little bit uncomfortable, because bodies are quite a personal thing, right? Like I have your body, I have my body, and you have your body, and we don't really share them with one another. We might share intimate contact with somebody, with a partner or a lover, but it's not something that we talk a lot about. We're physically located in bodies, and we're here without really thinking about it. When I think about myself, I don't think about myself as a piece of meat moving through the universe. I think about myself as a kind of point, like a point of light, like an intelligence moving through and interacting with different things. I don't really think about myself in poor old meat space, the way some people write about it. So on the left-hand side here, here's the body, and on the right-hand side, here's the world. And our bodies are really for helping us to interact with the world and change the world and interact with it as we go through the world. And my thinking on this comes from a few books. There's a guy called Stephen Johnson who talks about the natural history of innovation, like where good ideas come from and how we've developed our technology and our industries as a species over the course of civilization. James Gleick's written quite a bit about this, about the information, about how we as individuals and as societies and as a civilization have handled information. He talks about information being a history, a theory, and a flood. And I think there's some interesting stuff happening with information, how quickly it's coming at us, and how rapidly we have to deal with it these days, that are changing some things that really didn't change until this point in our development. Another good book, which is by a guy called Kevin Kelly, one of the Wired guys. He talks about what technology wants. He talks about technology being another alternative form of life, like something that has evolved on the planet to the point where it is now. He talks about the technetium, I think, the idea that the planet is developing technology which will become self-aware at some point, and that technology wants something. Technology is driving us somewhere. So if you look at technologies and things we've developed, obviously we developed the fire and the wheel first, and that was a little while ago. And things moved pretty slowly at the start, like fairly slow. And then we developed things like the steam engine and the internal combustion engine to interact with the world and to move us around the world. And then more recently we've developed any number of different gadgets and devices that help us interact with the world, not so much with the physical world, but with the world of information. And really, as we've gone down through the end of the 20th century, through the internet age, into the early part of this millennium and century, really it's become more and more about information and less about the physical world. I mean, look at Obama and Romney talking last night about the economy as a metric of foreign policy, and what's happened with manufacturing industries and them getting shipped out to jobs overseas and so forth. Really, if you talk about the cutting edge new technologies, it's largely about information management. It's largely about managing and handling and transferring information. And if you look at how we've done information in the past, you've got tablets, you've got books, obviously. More recently, we do most of our information interaction and transmission through the keyboard. And it can be a keyboard on your iPhone or your iPad or an actual keyboard like this. My wife got an email last night from a friend, and she was saying that she apologized for the length of the email, but she said, I'm dictating this using voice transcription software. I'm not actually typing it, I'm just talking. And hence there's like 14 paragraphs in my email. And devices are changing the way we communicate. There's no doubt about that. I'll talk a bit about that later on a little bit. So really, when it comes down to it, I'd say the way that we interact with the world these days is increasingly about the ones and zeros, less about physical contact, more about information. And really, it's technology that mediates that flow of information between us and the world around. That's where the iPhone comes in. That's where wireless network comes in. That's where DNS servers and the internet comes in. And I guess the question is, as we move forward with this way of interacting with the world through information, is it doing something to us as well? Are we actually becoming something different? And what effect does it have on the poor old-fashioned body? I was talking recently to a group of cardiac surgeons about the way that we train surgeons now compared to the way that we trained them 100 years ago, and the way that things are changing. And I was trying to put into context why we're running into problems with things like fatigue now, why surgeons get tired, why maybe we shouldn't work all night long anymore, why we shouldn't maybe operate all day after being on call all night. And it's because we're doing stuff that's actually more difficult now. Like the people that we operate on would have been dead already 50 years ago, or they wouldn't have survived to this point, or the operation, in fact, that they were having hadn't been developed 50 years ago. And the systems that we're using, the bodies that we're using to provide care with, get tired, the same as they always did. The systems we're providing or using to provide care and to train residents are the same as they've been for the last 100 years. And we're starting to bounce up against the limits of possibility here. We're doing difficult things. We're operating all this time. We're developing all these new operations. And we're coming up against some fairly hard constraints. Like we're actually being asked to push beyond perhaps the limits of the body, not just our patients' bodies, but our bodies as well. So I think as the world is changing, it's changing us and requiring us to look at bodies and ourselves in a different way. To talk about the problem with bodies for a minute, I came across this. There's a couple of groups on Facebook that I really like. There's IFLS, and if you know what IFLS is, it's a science group. It's very funny. And there's a bunch of other groups that basically post funny photographs every day. And this is one of the funny photographs that put up last week. If you ever start taking things too seriously, remember we're just talking monkeys, all loaded on a big organic spaceship flying through the universe. And I think that's very much where we need to remember, or what we need to remember about where we are at the moment. Bear in mind, we did not fall to this earth fully formed and fashioned the way we are today. We evolved from one state to another. And this is kind of what we evolved for, hunting animals on plains. And that's not the way the world is anymore. But our bodies are still largely adapted for that. In fact, if you look at some of the theories on the current epidemic of morbid obesity, our body's metabolism was probably designed to cope with scarcity. To say, well, I want you to go out and find as much energy as you can and bring it back and then share it with your family, and your family will just about eat enough to keep them alive, and then you've got to go out again to catch another animal or to get some more fruits and grains. And that's the kind of hunter-gatherer thing. And our metabolism worked very well when food was scarce. Having said that, we fast forward to the 1900s and in the 2000s, food is no longer scarce, and our bodies actually can't cope with the fact that we're suddenly putting all these calories into them. And that's one theory about where the obesity problem is coming from. We're not actually evolved, or the systems we have in our body aren't actually evolved to cope with what we're currently doing with them. And look at this guy hunting this animal compared to this guy today. I mean, when's the last time he went out and hunted an animal? He's probably looking at a picture of an animal on the internet. And you can see how we're using our bodies for different things now. We're, again, using them to relate to ones and zeros. Think about all the things that you see and all the things that you do in your life now that have to do with information. And I can see this happening in my own life because I've got a pile of books on my bedside table that's stacking up. I actually can't read. I can buy the books quicker than I can read the books. And I would have thought the iPad was a solution to this, like the Kindle app on the iPad. Trouble is, I buy a book and it sits on the iPad and I can't see it and I forget that it's there. Then the next time I remember to fire up the Kindle app, suddenly I've got 4 books that I haven't got around to, as well as the other books that are sitting on my bedside table. And like other people, I suspect I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed because it's the same with long-form drama on TV. Now that Netflix has finally got all their stuff out, people are watching Breaking Bad and Mad Men and Downton Abbey and Treme and Fringe and all these programs you wouldn't have caught up with before, but are able to watch whole seasons of them at one time. And the trouble is, there's just too much good stuff. Like I'm trying to catch up on the latest episode of Homeland, which was last night, and my friends watched it and I haven't, and I have to watch it tonight to try to keep up. Same with Sons of Anarchy. Anybody watching Sons of Anarchy? Watching Sons of Anarchy, the new episode comes out on a Tuesday night, and it's hard to keep up with the constant flow of information. You'll notice this as well if I was to take a poll of how many emails are currently in everybody's inbox, or in fact how many emails or texts you've got since 2 o'clock. That would be quite revealing, because there's a lot of stuff coming in. My phone is down there, and I've got it turned off so it's not beeping or anything. But there's stuff coming into it right now as I'm standing with you, and it never stops. I think I've got about 60 emails each day 60 emails that make it through the spam filter that get to me. So there's a lot of information coming at us, and I'm not sure that our brains are really predisposed to deal with that. And you see it in things like distracted driving, right? Here's a guy who's trying to drive and drink and send a text at the same time. And clearly, we don't understand this. Clearly, people who do distracted driving, and I've sent texts when I drive every so often. I'm trying to stop at home because it's clearly dangerous. We don't actually accept the informational limits of our bodies. We don't really want to understand that you can't drive and eat and text and listen to music and listen to the passenger in the back seat talking all at the same time. We actually can't cope with this flood of information. And I think it's a bit like the early Mac computers, right? They could do one thing well at one time. And we're a bit like that in terms of our informational capacity. The other problems with bodies, apart from the informational problems, as I said, we have a bit of a problem with food. Like we all enjoy eating food, but it's difficult to control how much you're eating. It's difficult to know how to manage your appetite, and it's difficult to know how to manage your weight. I was watching an interview on CNN last night with Bill Clinton, and they said Bill Clinton is looking really well. He's trying to get back to his high school weight. He's trying to get back to the weight that he was when he was a student in high school. So there's an ex-president of the United States who's struggling with his weight. At the same time, that's our first world problem, right? That we're all a bit too heavy. Here's the third world problem, which is that you've got people in the world who don't have enough to eat. The very same day in history as somebody struggling with their weight in the US, somebody struggling with famine in another part of the world. So our bodies have this kind of difficult relationship with food. There's the connection thing as well. I said, I'm in my body, you're in your body. But how do we connect with one another? How do we interact with one another? How do we recognize the same and the other? And how do we engage with people who aren't exactly the same as us? I have this discussion actually with the medical students about the millennial generation, Generation Y, right? I'm either the baby bust generation, which is the 5 years at the end of the baby boom, or else I'm a Generation X person. I've heard different stories. And how does that generation connect with this generation? How do we interact with one another? And when you're located in your body, how do you identify? Like, what do you identify with? Do I identify with other men because I'm a man? Do I identify with the white guys in the room because I'm a white guy? Do I identify with the British people or the Irish people or Canadians? I recently became a Canadian citizen. So how does identity fit in with your body as well? And there are certain things, not like I chose to be white, not like I chose to be male. I'm kind of stuck this way. But yet I have to identify and connect through my body. Of course, the trouble is that identity and connection sometimes breaks down. These guys all have a clear identity, right? And they're about to go and shoot and fight and kill people who have a different identity they don't feel very connected with. So there are downsides of connectedness and downsides of identity as well. You'll know as well that your body just doesn't function 24/7. You've got to go to bed sometimes, you've got to sleep sometimes. We're stuck in this physical body, we're limited by the physicality. And everybody in the last few hours has been to the bathroom, one way or another. And this is actually, it's one of the curious things of being a surgeon, in that I get to see things that other people don't see. I get to see the insides of people. And there's a real sort of mental flip around moment. I'll be operating on somebody at the start of the day, and we put that little camera in and we do whatever we have to do inside, and they end up with 3 or 4 little small cuts. And then they go back to the ward, and I operate on somebody else. And then I pop onto the ward later on for some other reason, and I meet the person walking down the ward that I was operating on at 9 o'clock. And I've got in my head that I was inside your body, and I saw all the things that are inside there, and at the same time, I'm seeing you from the outside. Right? When I meet a person for the first time, I don't think, I wonder what their liver looks like. Or gosh, I wonder, is their colon doing this, that, or the other? Or is their bladder? What's that like? I don't think about people as the collection of organs that they ultimately are. Think about them as a whole. But here in this room, there are 20 or 30 bladders that are slowly filling, colons that are slowly passing gas. There are stomachs that are full or not full or rumbling perhaps. And these are the physical bodies that we are in. The other limitation is that I can't go exactly where I want to go. I can't be exactly where I want to be unless I choose to co-locate. Like I had to get on a plane, I had to drive to EIA, get on the airplane, fly to Ottawa to go to this meeting last week, to be in the same room as some people to hear them talk. And the talking is just them making vibrations with their neck here, right? And I could have that transmitted over the internet, right? But there are certain things you've got to be in the room for. You've got to be physically present in the room sometimes. I don't know if anybody was at Sebastian Thrun's talk recently about new paradigms in online education. Kim and I were talking about this a little while ago, and saying that he's a scholar from Stanford, and he knows a lot about and teaches a course on artificial intelligence and computing. So he decided he had about 200 students in his class in Stanford apparently, and he decided to put this course online for free. And he got 150,000 people to sign up for it, and I was one of them actually, went through the course. And he noticed that the students in Stanford weren't coming to his lectures just as much. He's used to having a full lecture hall with 200 people, and only 40 would turn up, say. So we asked them why, and they said that they preferred the online version. Like the physical version of him was inconvenient. It was at a time that didn't suit them. You can't pause him when he's talking in real time. You can't rewind him and stop him and go back and look something up. And they actually preferred the online version of Sebastian Thrun than the physical version that they had to co-locate with. And we find the same in our medical school at the moment. Students can get up in the morning, wash and dress and get on the bus and come to the medical school and sit in the lecture hall with you while you give the lecture, or they can watch the recorded version an hour and a half later. That means they get to sleep a bit longer, they get to shuffle around the house in their slippers and their dressing gown and have a nice morning and drink coffee and answer the door if the mailman comes. And slowly we're saying, well, do we have to be physically located in the same space as other people? Is there a way technology can take away this need to be co-located with people? As we talked about with our slide on food and stuff, the body is sort of, yes, it sort of does mostly what you want, but it doesn't do all the things you want. It's sort of unruly. It sort of doesn't obey your will all the time. And I recently got a personal trainer, actually, and obviously I'm going to end up looking exactly like this guy, I hope. But the personal trainer is putting me through all these things, all these movements that I don't normally do, and I'm finding out my arms and legs don't actually do the things I want them to do. He says, make this move, put your arm here, lift it up, and I do it 2 or 3 times, and suddenly my arm is shaking, or my leg is shaking, and I can't make it do what I want it to do. My body's got limitations that I don't really recognize most of the time. Except when the personal trainer puts me in a position where it becomes obvious to me that I'm not really in control of my body. Sometimes my body's in control of me. Like, for instance, this guy, and he's trying to figure out what his waist circumference is. I don't think he ever thought that he would get to be this size, right? But somehow or other his body has taken control of this and said, well, you're going to be a bit larger than you would really like to be. People who are this weight are obviously struggling quite a bit. We are, as I said earlier on when I talked about trauma and stabbing and stuff, we are fairly fragile. I mean, this is a human being label. This way up, handled with care, fragile, keep dry. 100% organic, contents may vary in color. We don't do well with extremes of heat and cold. We don't like radiation. We don't like the absence of oxygen. We don't like being dropped from a great height or submerged underwater or subjected to great pressures. We are fairly fragile. And I think sometimes this is the mistake that some doctors make, is that they think they're made of different stuff from their patients. They think that there's them and us when it comes to being a doctor, and in fact it's really all just us. We're all made of exactly the same stuff. Doctors get sick as well. Doctors die too. It's not just patients who do that, because we're all fairly fragile. And here's a patient whose body kind of let her down, right? She's got a big breast cancer, replacing most of her breast. She's got a mass under her arm as well. And I think a lot of patients who have diseases like this wonder why. Like, why did my body kind of turn against me like this? What is it that I did to deserve this? Because I took care of my body and I fed it and I clothed it and all those good things, but yet somehow it turned against me and it's gonna kill me eventually. So I'd say we're fairly fragile, and it's one of those things that you maybe only think about as you get a little bit older. I mean, I've known people who aren't here anymore. I know people who died, friends of mine who had some misfortune, or a friend actually who died last year of breast cancer when she was 40. I had another guy, actually a guy who was in my class in medical school, who was in a car crash and died when he was 24. And we don't dwell on that when we're young, but as you get older, you start to realize we are fairly fragile. I mean, any of us could get hit by a bus on the way home tonight and it would be game over. We are fragile beings and we don't do well with not being treated nicely. We also don't have a whole lot of time. I mean, I don't know about you, but 70 years and 10 doesn't seem like a lot of time to me. It's gone past fairly quickly. I'm in my 40s now. So it may be that I'm past the halfway point now. You know, my battery life, a little bar at the top of your iPhone is only half full for me. Said to medical students recently, you know, I have to make sure that you do a good job when you become good doctors, because I'm going to die soon and you're going to have to take over for me, because we have a limited time span here. And as I said about my friends who aren't here anymore, being in a body means we have to cope with loss. We have to cope with the fact that people we love won't be here forever, and we won't be here forever either, and that they go sometimes. And what is it? Jim Morrison said, no one here gets out alive, right? You're stuck in a body. You're not going to make it out the door at the end of this. So to sum up then, the good side of biology is it's free. Like, you get a free copy every time you're born. Fantastic. It's fairly familiar. We're used to it. Like, I don't know what it would be like to be somewhere else. I'm kind of used to being in this body. I'm fairly familiar. It is self-replicating, and it's mostly self-repairing. When I operate on people, their wounds heal by themselves. I don't make the wounds heal. They kind of repair by themselves. So the body's not bad at that. It's got a long but not infinite battery life. It does kind of look after itself. Well, I teach medical students about a thing called homeostasis, where we talk about how the body regulates its heart rate and its breathing. You don't have to sit here and remind your heart to beat all the time. You don't have to sit here and remember to breathe. A lot of those systems work by themselves. So it allows you to think about other more interesting things because it runs itself. It's homeostatic. It's not actually badly designed for this physical environment. It's got all the stuff you need to function well on this planet. Like, we have opposable thumbs, and there are some species that would kill for this. This is opposable thumb. It's just fantastic. We've got bipedal locomotion. We can stand up and walk around. And we've got probably the best thing that we ever evolved with, which is the brain, which is just fantastic. And it's kind of all we've got for now. It's a bit disrespectful talking about alternatives to the body, actually, because we're in these bodies, right? They belong to us. How dare you talk about something different? In fact, how dare you consider the downside? Downside is, though, they're fairly unreliable and they're fragile for reasons I've talked about already. Unlike your iPhone, there is no backup. My iPhone crashes tonight, I put it in the dock, it restores from yesterday's backup, we're good to go again. If I crash tonight, game over, I'm gone. You cannot restore after a crash. You do get a free one when you're born, but there's no warranty, you cannot return it to the maker, and it's single use only. It's not reusable. I say it has a limited shelf life. It goes off after a while. Some of the basic functions are a bit messy, like pooping and peeing, and I suppose eating. I mean, we have to actually kill other animals and chop their bodies up and apply heat to them and then put them into our bodies for us to live. And that's kind of messy when you think about it. Making new units is fun, but it's kind of slow. Like, if I was to say, you can have a new iPhone and you can order it today and come back and it'll be ready in 9 months, that would be next summer, right? That wouldn't be very good. As we talked about with the information limits of the body, the processor speeds in the body are a bit limited. Like, we're talking about, as I say, a basic entry-level Mac, perhaps, in the very first generation of Macs. And there's a limited capacity for upgrades. There are certain upgrades we can do, and we'll talk about some of the upgrades in a minute. But the capacity is kind of limited.